Hi, in this video, we're going to talk about an example of using the for loop, and that is to add up a sequence of numbers. Now, I recorded this video a while back, and I actually made a mistake of naming a variable as sum, S-U-M. The problem with that is it hides or shadows a built-in function that is also named sum. So while the example itself works, just keep in mind that that is something that I should not have done. So let's say we actually want to sum the number from sum the sequence of number 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to some end. I think we actually did that as our first assignment, but that's in the first assignment, n is it's not terribly big. But here, what if we want to n to be fairly large, let's say 100, or my favorite number, a million, a billion, whatever, right? A large number. Now, you may have heard of this story of the famous mathematician Gauss. So he actually, in elementary school, where else do you figure this sort of thing out, right? He actually figured a quick way to add this sequence of number together. Um, so if you're interested, there's a link that describes the story if you haven't heard of it. But well, not many of us, especially in elementary school, can probably figure this out. Now, the good thing though is we actually have a computer and we have Python. So we can just write a few lines of code that will be able to add the sequence of numbers up. So to do that, let me, okay, well, I already wrote that. I was going to write that live. But okay, so anyway, so let's say I'm going to specify the n, right? So to add a number up to and including 100, I have to say n is 101. And I create a variable here that is sum. I call it sum. So the intended use for this variable is that it's going to accumulate all the numbers, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to accumulate the sum of all of them in this particular variable. Now, what is the sum before we start adding up the numbers together? Well, hopefully that you agree with me that it's 0, right? Before we add any numbers up, the sum is 0. Okay, now the sequence of number. What's the sequence of number we have? Well, it goes from 1 to 100. Okay, and we give that and we assign that number. Well, we assign each of that number in the sequence to the variable I. Okay, so the first time around the loop, I is going to be 1. Second time, I is 1. Third time, sorry, wait. The first time I is 1. Second time I is 2. Third time I is 3, and so on and so forth. And what do we do with I? Well, we add I to the sum that we have calculated so far up to that particular iteration. And then once we add these two things together, the I at that particular iteration with the sum so far up to that iteration, then we remember the sum of these two back into our variable, the accumulator. And then in the end, once we've gone through all the numbers, we just print out the sum, and the end is kind of useful. And actually, I think there's a bug. Yes, there's a bug. Um, so we say, basically the sum of 1 plus 2 plus blah, blah, blah all the way is 50-50. If you actually do this by hand, there is a bug because this number should be 100, not n itself. So I should do a minus 1 here. So yeah, the sum of 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to 100 is 5050. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, take a little bit of time and go through the slides again, maybe. Again, the way we do it, the list of numbers, the sequence of number, that's what range give us. Sum is where we accumulate all the numbers. Right? Before we start, we initialize to 0 because we haven't added any numbers. And then in each iteration, we accumulate one more number and storing that into sum. Now, if this is still unclear to you, I have something else that might help. And that is going back to our loop unrolling that I talked about earlier. We can unroll the loop. Well, we unrolled it in a sense, but we are not going to really write out all the code. But instead, we're just going to step through the code line by line, and then at the end of each line, we look at what the variables are, what values they hold, and hopefully that would give you an idea of how this works. So let's start. So assuming we have executed the first two lines and we're here, right? At this point, what is I? Well, I doesn't quite exist yet. That comes in the next line. What is sum? Well, we have a sum. We set the sum to 0. Okay, so we go into the loop. Once we pass the loop control, the first line, we get our first I, right? Our first I is 1. We did not change the sum, so the sum is still 0. We execute the next line, right? The next line does, this line does sum, which is 0, plus I, which is 1. So 0 plus 1, that gives us a 1. We assign that to sum. So sum is updated to 1. I hasn't changed yet. Well, we go around the loop now. So the next thing is that, okay, we execute the loop control. Now I gets a new value from the sequence. The next value in the sequence is 2. Again, sum did not change here. Now we execute the next line, which adds sum and I. So that gives us a 3. That 3 gets assigned to the sum variable. So sum becomes 3. I is not changed in this line. And hopefully you see where I'm going now. We go back to the top of the loop and we fetch the next number from the range sequence. So after 2, it's going to be 3. I is 3. Sum is still 3. We execute the next line. Sum plus I is 6. Okay, and we assign 6 to sum. And then we keep going. Right? This is how it's able to accumulate all these numbers together. And if you want to verify that, right? So far, we executed the loop 3 times. So we add up the number 1, 2, and 3. And the sum of that is 6, which is what we accumulated so far. Okay, hopefully that helps. One thing, this is actually a good place to introduce a very frequently used shorthand, and that is this particular expression. Um, this is basically incrementing sum by I. And because it happens so much, there's a shorthand for it. So you can just do plus equals. What this means is it adds I to sum, and not only it adds the two numbers together, but sum gets that new number. Okay, so yeah, these two expressions or statements, they are exactly the same. Okay, and so other things, like if you just want to increment the like a particular variable by one, instead of doing I equal to I plus one, you can just say I plus equals one, etc., etc. Okay. For the C++ or Java programmer among you, you'll be wondering, is there a I++ um, statement in Python? The answer is no, you cannot do that. For a number of reasons, you probably can find do a little search on online to why Python doesn't like this particular type of statement. So if you want to increment by one, decrement by one, use this.